You are listening to the Roberta Glass True Crime Report, putting the true back in true crime. From New York City, Roberta Glass is now on the record. My guest, Gary Meece, is the author of 3 books on the West Memphis Three: Blood on Black, The Case Against the West Memphis Three, and Where the Monsters Go, and the 3rd book, The Case Against the West Memphis Three Killers. He also has his own podcast on Podbean called, once again, The Case Against the West Memphis Three Killers. On his podcast, he breaks down all the evidence against the West Memphis Three, and he knows everything about that case. He's joining me today to talk about the role public relations plays in criminal cases. Welcome, Gary Meece.
Hi, Roberta.
Thank you so much for doing this. I wrote you asking if you wanted to do this episode. You said, oh yeah, I'm intensely interested in this subject now. What makes you intensely interested in it?
Well, partially because I see a huge trend going where the whole idea of people being guilty is somehow being tossed aside. I mean, needless to say, there's a lot of unrest, and obviously people who are being arrested are not going to be convicted of anything if they die in the process of being arrested. But, you know, a lot of these people aren't good people. They're not good guys, and they're breaking the law while this is going on, and they're getting a huge pass. I also just see things such as just a continuing thing with things like Making a Murderer and, of course, I'm Paradise Lost, but, you know, they're just year after year, there's more and more of a trend toward the idea that there are all these people in prison with wrongful convictions. Kim Kardashian's been pushing this very hard. And so we got the case, for instance, of the lady from Memphis, Tennessee, and I can't think of her name right now, who, you know, I think she served 22 years in prison. She wasn't a violent drug dealer, but she was a major drug dealer. And she's sort of being treated like a hero. And, you know, I'm not really against the idea of perhaps 22 years is long enough even for a major drug dealer to be in prison. What bothers me is that she's being treated as some sort of hero, somebody to look up to, et cetera, et cetera. What's her name? LaToya Brown? Did I get the first name right?
I'm not sure. I'm interested in really violent people. So that was the least offensive to me. And I agree with you. I don't want her to be treated as a hero, but we saw that with Rick Ross, the rapper, stole his name. You know, you really want to emulate the guy who brought crack to California? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I will say, you know, this has been going on for the idea that there are people who are wrongfully convicted and let's get behind them and let's change the system has been going on for a very long time, longer than any of us have been alive. But it seems to have picked up steam over the years, and particularly in the last 30 years. There seems to have been a confluence of particularly bothersome to me or lazy journalism is lazy journalism and overworked journalists for that matter. They really just don't have time to do anything, so they just take the easiest narrative and go with that. You've got defense attorneys who now are working very hard on institutionalizing their defense strategies so that, you know, when they go to court, they've got more and more advantages. You and I talked briefly about like the push against using eyewitnesses as valid witnesses in a criminal case. Who does that benefit? It doesn't benefit the crime victims. It benefits the defense and it benefits the criminals. And I'll be the first to say, eyewitness testimony is not the best testimony. They're not the best witnesses. It's not the best evidence, but it is evidence and it needs to be considered in these criminal cases. To totally discount it is really almost criminal in and of itself. You've got these foundations and groups and advocacy groups like the Innocence Project who, you know, they do some good things, but they also push for these, what they consider to be systematic problems. And it's all to the benefit of the criminal. It's never to the benefit of the victim. It's never to the benefit of society at large. And they're really pushing for changes in laws, for instance. And it's really aiming at a structural change. You've got DAs coming in, mostly we talked about this briefly, but, these large cities, San Francisco, Chicago, Philadelphia, Portland. I mean, obviously those DAs are obviously predisposed to let people walk. And they really think there's something fundamentally wrong with sending somebody to jail, apparently.
Right. I mean, if people want to reform the drug laws in this country, fine. People talk about the mass incarceration. That's one of the biggest arguments. Why do we have so many people in prison in this country? Is this kind of overzealous incarceration in our country? What do you think about that?
Well, if you look at the people who are actually in jail, many of them have a long string of crimes behind them. And it's really a wonder they've stayed out of jail as long as they have till they finally arrived for a while. And when they get out, they're going to be back again very soon because they're committing serious crimes. Drug crimes is a whole different thing. I would be the first to say that all needs to be addressed. There are some real systemic problems in the justice system, and a lot of it does have to do with things like resources and money. If you've got enough money, you can pretty much get away with almost anything.
And that never gets talked about. I just watched that in the NXIVM trial. I watched Claire Bronfman pay $4.6+ million for a deal. And after that, we were all appalled. All the people who watched the trial were appalled by it. And yet, it wasn't really talked about. Is it a less interesting story that the rich kind of walk or can buy their own justice in this country?
Yeah, and it's an obvious story. And, I can remember a case I covered, a murder case I covered over 40 years ago, where this fairly affluent farmer down here in Mississippi hired two black kids, little teenagers, I think they were 17 or 18, to go shoot this construction worker because he had an eye on this guy's wife. And these two kids, for $100 in a used car, a really old car, went and actually did this thing. And then they get charged with capital murder, and he gets charged with something like manslaughter or something like that. And I think he ultimately walked. Guess what? He had money. They didn't. It was fundamentally unfair, and I think there are ways to address that problem, but nobody wants to talk about that. Part of the reason is because to do this, you'd have to look at what lawyers are paid, how they're paid, who's paying them, et cetera. And if you just made it like a national health care system, a national legal system, where everybody just gets a lawyer, you get a lawyer just like so-and-so. You could do it that way and, pay them a salary and they go and represent you in court, kind of like everybody gets a public defender. Well, who's in favor of that? The lawyers certainly aren't. The rich and powerful and connected certainly aren't. The large corporations who would be under the same kind of rules certainly aren't in favor of that. So without that kind of fundamental change, nothing's going to change. And nobody even wants to talk about that. And I'm not suggesting we even go to that system, but I'm just saying that is part of what goes on.
What's also not talked about is the fact that when the Innocence Project have endless resources, I think they have a $22 million endowment. That's on top of whatever else money they raise in the millions.
I was just looking at their 2018 figures, and they had 14 million that came in, and they spent something like 13 million. So,
me too. Yeah, Delta Airlines. Well, You look at the people who
big corporations.
Sure, give a lot of money, and so when they go up against a prosecutor, they're also connected to these law schools. They have endless amounts of interns, experts. These prosecutors are outmatched. And that's kind of goes against what our natural inclination. We look at the state as all powerful. It's really not true in these kind of cases.
An easy example for you and me is the West Memphis Three case. Not in the initial cases, but in the appeals. You look at what the resources of the state, and you compare that to the resources of the West Memphis Three when they had millions and millions of dollars at their disposal. and they could hire the best experts anywhere to come in and testify and the best attorneys to represent them. I mean, is it any surprise that the state at some point decided, let's work out a deal rather than go toe to toe with all this? And even then I'm not sure they really would have walked. I don't think they would have. In fact, I'm pretty sure Jesse Miskelly was not going to be going anywhere. There was no real basis for him going anywhere at that point.
You think Jason Baldwin had the best chance of all the three of them of walking?
The evidence against him was not strong at the initial trial, and it was going to be a lot weaker in any retrial. I'm sure they had some evidence they were holding back. I think they had some evidence they would be holding back. But if you just took him and separated his case from Eccles, he's tried separately, it would be very difficult to try that case and get some kind of conviction. I don't know how they would do it on the basis of what they had in 1994. That doesn't mean I think he's innocent. Far from it. But I just think it would have been very, very difficult for him to have been found guilty again. And it raises the question of why he would have taken the deal that he took, which is to plead guilty and walk rather than wait a couple of months, go for a retrial, and maybe that might be another year or two. But eventually they were going to have to, there was a good chance that they would have to go to new trials and he could get out and then turn around and sue the state for, they exaggerate the sums, but I'm certain it wouldn't have been nothing. Certainly could have gotten something out of the state with a civil suit at that point. So
my understanding was that Arkansas, that you couldn't do that. Is that not true? Is that wrong?
No, you could do that.
Okay.
You could do that. In fact, that was one of the concerns that the prosecutor, Scott Ellington, had in the prosecution was he didn't really want the state to be liable for damages if there was a retrial. That was not the only concern, but it was a concern.
Do people ask you or comment sort of, yeah, right, like the state would let them plead guilty, be the Alford, if they thought they were really guilty?
Oh, yeah, I hear that all the time. Even people who don't know much about the case would go, yeah, why would they ever let these horrible child killers go? You know, they had to know they were innocent. Well, you know, the fact is that Arkansas and a lot of other states let convicted killers that they know have done horrible crimes, they let them walk after a certain point in many, many, many cases. West Memphis Three, without the pressure that they had from the outside, not just in the courts, but in the public sphere, which is a lot of what we're talking about, public perception, the PR, the marketing, the DA getting emails and phone calls and letters every day saying, please let these poor innocent boys go. After a while, that does have an effect on you. Mm-hmm. And it makes it a lot easier to go, you know, this is really annoying having to deal with this every day. I don't think he really cared about the case. And hey, let them go. They've done 18 years. That's plenty. In many countries, that would be plenty.
Damien Eccles was, now of course I'm blocked by him on Twitter, but at the time, before I was blocked,
yeah, I got blocked on Instagram too, which.
Oh, really?
I guess he finally figured that one out. But anyway.
And without having really any interaction with him, I guess word got around. So I guess he was tweeted at by the Making a Murderer Stephen Avery supporters, asking what he could do to help them. And of course, Eccles doesn't help anyone besides himself. And he, in a generous moment, gave a piece of advice, which was get a PR person. I can't remember exactly his words. That's a paraphrase. And he had, the West Memphis Three had Lonnie Surrey, who runs Surrey Communications in New York. He's represented Jesse Friedman, Marty Tankleff. I'm not sure what he had to do. He said he was a supporter of the Central Park Five, which makes me think that he had something to do a little bit, at least, with their PR. The list is as long as your arm of the people that he's supported or been a PR representative of. You had some interactions with Lonnie Surrey. Can you talk about that?
What happened, I was working at a very small daily paper in West Memphis, Arkansas. And this is probably 2012, 2013. It was after they were released. And Damien Eccles was doing a lot of marketing and And he was making money by going to colleges and talking and going to libraries and talking and doing seminars, all sorts of stuff at that time. All that's gone away now, apparently. But there were other things going on, and I was writing about them on a fairly regular basis. And what I did was, instead of saying they were wrongly convicted, I was just referring to them as if they'd been convicted of murdering 3 small children. Called them convicted killers. It kind of amazed me, but all the way in New York, Lonnie Suri got this notice that Gary Meece down in West Memphis, Arkansas, was writing about Damien Echols in a way that wasn't sufficiently respectful. And he calls me. I think he called me twice. And we had a conversation. He was nice enough. He was really trying to arm twist me to stop doing this because everybody knew that they were innocent. And why am I doing this? Just look at the facts of the case, et cetera, et cetera. And I wasn't buying any of it. And I told him that. I said, I've looked at the case. They're guilty as far as I'm concerned. They pleaded guilty. They were convicted by a jury. I'm not going out of my way in the way I'm writing the story. I'm just not writing this as if they're innocent like everybody else. And after the second conversation, I never heard back from him. I could tell he's very dissatisfied. I get a call pretty much around the same time for somebody of indeterminate gender in London who basically went down the same spiel. Why was I doing this, et cetera, et cetera. And they were running some sort of bulletin board. So I talked to them, and he or she didn't get anywhere with me and finally gave up on me. And I looked at the bulletin board in a day or two, and there's a conversation between this person and Suri in which he says, well, I tried to talk to this guy in West Memphis, but I finally just gave up on him. I could tell I wasn't getting anywhere. But it was funny, really.
Was he trying to appeal to your morality or to the herd mentality? Everybody knows they're innocent. What's wrong with you kind of thing?
Yeah, all the reputable journalists all know he's innocent. What's wrong with you?
They love to use status. I guess that's called an appeal to authority. So they get experts to go out and talk about whether they're always ex-FBI people or any of the experts that they used in the false confession experts. I think he runs and he has a bunch of websites, false confession whatever, wrongfulconviction.info. And I was just looking before we started this. And one of the big flags for me, red flags, is when they don't have the transcripts up. So where the documents are is basically nothing. There's no court records, no court documents, which would give you both sides, not just the prosecutor side. It would give you the defense too. I think people forget that the court documents are both sides of the case. So that's always a big red flag. But the other interesting thing is, I also saw on his website, he was sort of writing a press release with all the talking points, with sort of cut and paste from the court documents, just like small sections, like all their talking points. Is that just so a journalist can take that and just basically rewrite his press release? Is that what happens?
Yes, and it makes it really easy. A lot of journalists seem to really like the information that came out of that big, like with the West Memphis case, a lot of journalists seem to really like the information that came out of that big press conference the defense had when they presented all these experts that they could quote, Warner Spitz and so forth. And so it makes it very easy. And frankly, I'm really not trying to run journalists down so much. I was in journalism for a long time. It's an extremely overworked and underappreciated and underpaid profession. And most of the time, a lot of them are kind of lazy. And I might put myself in that category as well at times. And so the easiest thing to do is just whatever the easiest way of accessing the information is, just go with that. And particularly if nobody else is going to call me on it, then that's great. At times I try to hold myself up to a higher standard. I do. Even then, I would say it's difficult at times. It's very difficult and it's time consuming to do an in-depth study of any of these cases. And so not everybody's saying this now, but everybody was saying, oh, poor Stephen Avery. Or they're saying poor Damien Echols or poor Ryan Ferguson or poor Amanda Knox. It's easy to go with that because you're not going to get any flack as a journalist for doing that. Where you are going to get flack is going, the three men who killed three little boys in West Memphis, Arkansas in 1993 and go on from there, you're going to get some flack about that, except I was calling the shots in West Memphis, so I could just do what I wanted. I was the editor. I didn't have to answer to anybody. And I didn't care what somebody at the New York Times might think of that, or even the Commercial Appeal might think of that. So it made it easy for me to do that, but I was in a weirdly privileged position, even though it was badly overworked and underpaid and underappreciated.
It's interesting because you only find with the West Memphis Three, it's always going to be in smaller websites, smaller papers, any kind of more balanced reporting, accurate reporting, any of the prosecution side, not just the defense. Rolling Stone writes just these love letters to the West Memphis Three and Damien Echols, you know. Is that to please the public or to please people like Lonnie Surrey?
To please Lonnie Surrey and to please the reporters are often writing for the editors. Most of the time, they're going to write something that the editors are going to like reading, and they're not going to write anything that's going to cause a red flag for the editors.
So in everything you read about the West Memphis Three post-release, most journalists write that they were exonerated or released because of DNA evidence, despite that being not true. How did the West Memphis Three's PR impress that on the minds of the public?
Well, I have to tell you, I've been looking at, it's not just Lonnie Surrey, but I've been looking at Lonnie Surrey's website, and he impresses, if anybody's reading this, that the Lori Davis and the group of activists there came up with all this new evidence that they were going to present to the evidentiary hearing and get a new trial. And you take that sort of message and you send it out there often enough, and it gets to be accepted as gospel. I also looked at what Lori Davis's advocacy was doing at the time, Arkansas Take Action. And it's just amazing the long list of things that they were doing. And a lot of it had to do with presenting a false view of the case. But, you know, they had rallies. They had a big concert with Eddie Vedder and Natalie Maines, Patti Smith, other people in Little Rock. They did on-the-street surveys. They did flyers. They did posters. They did T-shirts. They did letter writing campaigns to newspapers. They worked very hard on media relations to suck up to reporters, television producers, etc. You know, petitions, just a long list of things. Every trick in the book they threw out there, and a lot of this had to do with the fact that they were promoting this idea that they were really coming up with all this wonderful new stuff. And, you know, of course, it really begs the question, if they had all this, again, can't be repeated often enough, if they had all this wonderful new DNA information, if that's what it was, if this new evidence was DNA information, why didn't they take it to an evidentiary hearing, which was going to be 4 months from the actual release date that they requested? They sought out that release date. They sought out that guilty plea, that Alford plea. All they had to do was wait 4 months, and they were going to have an evidentiary hearing and quite possibly get new trials. If they had really good evidence, they almost certainly would have gotten new trials. There's no evidence that they have any DNA evidence that's any good at all. And in fact, Patrick Binka and Dustin McDaniel, according to an article that was in the Arkansas Times in the summer of 2011, had a meeting. They met in July over lunch. They went to law school together. Patrick Binka is a defense attorney. Dustin McDaniel was the Attorney General of Arkansas at the time. And that is where they worked out this deal for the Alford plea. And Patrick Binka tells Dustin McDaniel that, you know, this evidence thing isn't working out all that well for us. You know, we really don't have that much. So
we better do something. And that something was the Alford plea, right? So they were working on behalf of the West Memphis Three, those two lawyers?
Binka was definitely working on it. Now, Dustin McDaniel did what I would consider to be like classic Arkansas triangulation, which is he was saying that, these guys are guilty. We really held their feet to the fire to get, and got the best deal for the state and the best deal for them. they're guilty, and all the evidence points to it. Privately, he's doing this totally different thing with Patrick Pinkett. They are now law partners together.
Amazing.
So, they talk about corruption and cronyism and everything else in the West Memphis Three case. Supporters do. But when you actually ask what corruption they're actually talking about, they really can't come up with anything. The best they can come up with is inefficient, somewhat, and sometimes downright inept police investigation. But that's not criminal, and it's not even uncommon. Most of these big criminal cases were poorly handled at some point. It's just the nature of police work in some ways. I think they're getting better because they're getting better trained. They're getting more scientific with it. But, when it really comes down to it, they don't really have anything. But when there's an actual case of two cronies working out a special deal with each other and then going over to their Scott Ellington, who is, without getting into partisan politics, Scott Ellington thought he could run as a Democrat and basically get into Congress. And he did not want this case going on at the time while he's running for Congress. So he wanted it out of the way. That's part of what was going on there. Not all of it, but part of it.
And that's so interesting because Damien Echols, one of his big PR points is that the prosecutors used this case because they all wanted to get elected and they all wanted to move forward, and prosecuting him wrongfully would move them all forward. But what you're saying is on their side, there was some of that going on. Exactly what Damien Echols is accusing the prosecution of being ambitious, of using them as political pawns.
Right. I don't think the case would have affected Dustin McDaniel as much as it would have Scott Ellington, because McDaniel wouldn't have been in charge of the prosecution except in a really remote fashion as being the attorney general. But at that time, Dustin McDaniel he was widely acknowledged as a real contender for the governor's office. And then he got embroiled within a year or two after that in a big sex scandal and had to drop out of everything and just become a high-priced lawyer. But there was a lot of that going on. And it's kind of a mirror image of what supposedly was going on the other side. John Fogelman, at some point, he's a judge now, and he did run for Supreme Court, and he did lose that election. But, he was a guy who was on track to be a judge at some point anyway. And he was the assistant prosecutor in the case. What's the name of the judge? I can't think of it right now.
Barnett or Burnett?
David Barnett. David Barnett, he did go on to become, a state legislator. But, the thing is people in those sorts of positions move on and they move up and they change what they're doing over time. And it's hard to see how the West Memphis Three case really benefited him that much. He probably was going to be in the positions that he was in one way or the other, and that you could say the same thing for John Fogelman, whose family is amazingly well connected in Crittenden County. They are the premier political family in West Memphis, with the exception of the Ingrams. And arguably the Fogelmans are ahead of the Ingrams at this point. They were there before the Ingrams. And I know this is inside baseball, but that's just the way it is.
Arkansas Take Action, was that Lori Davis's?
Lori Davis's.
She started that? That was her organization?
Right. Mm-hmm. Now, I will tell you what's interesting is if you look at Sowery's website, it makes it sound like Lori Davis was in there fighting for the West Memphis Three from like virtually the week that she saw the documentary. And she was on some level, but she only really got involved in, this real, like an organized effort in the mid-2000s, the first decade, whatever you call that, of the 2000s. And prior to that, she was working sort of one-on-one privately. There was a group of people in Little Rock where she'd moved that were really involved in promoting the idea of exoneration for the West Memphis Three, getting them out of prison, et cetera, free the West Memphis Three, they're still selling T-shirts if anybody wants to buy one. I was just looking on their site. So she got involved with them, and that's the group. Cappy Peck, who apparently is like a very well-connected Little Rock woman, has a restaurant, or she certainly had a restaurant at one point and probably still does. And anyway, they're all very well connected over there, kind of buddies with Mara Leverett. Again, it's not a tiny town, but it's a relatively small town over there. And they all sort of know each other. and there's little districts, little pockets where everybody sort of agrees with everybody about certain things, and it would be the West Memphis Three is they're innocent. Anyway, it had a lot of support over there. It was grassroots in many ways, and they did get a lot of money from around the world. What's interesting is that prior to Lori Davis really signing on to this and really getting involved with this, there were these people from California.
The KGB, right? The KGB.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Captain Backing, Bert Sauls, Grove Pashley, who had formed WestMemphis3.org way back in the mid-90s. They were doing a lot of work then. It was really very cutting edge for that time and really got one of the first crowdfunding efforts of sorts kind of off the ground at that point. In other words, they were raising real money for the West Memphis Three, or at least some money for the West Memphis Three very early in this process. Now, if you look at Lonnie Sowery's webpage about the West Memphis Three, has no mention of any of that. They don't even mention the Paradise Lost movies.
Interesting.
The Paradise Lost movies, maybe they're mentioned somewhere in all the stuff with Arkansas Take Action, but I was looking over it today. It doesn't mention anything about the Paradise Lost movies. They don't mention anything about the KGB people except in a very general sort of sense. And you kind of get the sense that, Lori Davis was the one who was really involved doing that. Well, she wasn't. She might have been a supporter. I'm certain she began working with on some level, but she was not central to that effort early on. And then you look at West of Memphis, the movie, which is produced by, among others, Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, Damien Eccles, Lori Davis. And how objective is that going to be about a case where Damien Eccles is the accused killer and one of the other executive producers is married to the accused killer? And in many ways, it is kind of a love story, icky as it is, between Damien Eccles and Lori Davis. And she comes across as this extremely heroic figure battling almost all on her own to get her husband out of prison for a crime he didn't do. And there's no mention at all, this very long movie, no mention at all of KGB. They may mention Paradise Lost, but certainly they don't dwell on it a great deal. And anybody who argues that, I hate to throw credit to Berlinger and Sinofsky, but what they did make freedom for the West Memphis Three possible. It would not have happened without them. It also would not have happened without the efforts of KGB. After the movie came out, the documentary came out on HBO, there was no organized effort to help the West Memphis Three. I was reading today, they went to visit Damien and Jason and I guess Jesse in Arkansas like a year or two later, and nothing was going on. They hadn't even seen their attorneys in a while. So they got involved in this sort of activist movement to get the West Memphis Three involved. And some of this is about Lori Davis giving herself credit. She hires Lonnie Sowery. Lonnie Sowery really pushes the idea that Lori Davis is this, the pivot point for Damien Eccles' bid for innocence, bid for a release, being successful. I'm sure it helped, but it certainly wasn't the genesis of all this. And at the point where she got involved, there was so much money involved, so many high-priced lawyers involved, and so much moving through the courts, that really what she was doing was, it's good for them. They brought in some money they wouldn't have gotten otherwise through things like concerts and all these other fundraising efforts. And yeah, they did influence the media, but a lot of the effort to get the West Memphis Three out of prison was already in place. And for her to take something like full credit for it, it's kind of like, or to try to do that is ridiculous, actually.
And you can see the KGB in, I believe it's the second Paradise Lost movie, where they're talking to Damien Eccles on the phone from prison, and it looks like there's some kind of chat going on, like it's being broadcast. I'm not sure if it is or not, but it looks like there's some group chat on the computer. Do you remember that?
What they're doing.
That was really ahead of its time for that time that it was filmed. And he's talking about John Mark Byers being phony and fake, right? Because that was the suspect back then. That was their first big alternative suspect, right?
Right. And Baldwin and Eccles, both in that second movie, one of them says that they're 100% sure that Mark Byers is the killer.
It's so great.
One of the big problems, and Mara Leverett wrote a whole book in which she didn't really come out and say he killed his son and these other two boys. She devoted so much space to his divorce troubles and his problems with his business and this and that. Why would you spend all that time trashing somebody if you don't want to try to make them look as guilty as possible? And that is exactly what she did. Doing some research, reading something from her today, it's just incredible how she minimizes and distorts the whole record here. No physical evidence, no real evidence at trial, et cetera, et cetera. And she knows better. She's lying, and she knows she's lying, but she doesn't care.
So do you think it's a money thing for Mara Everett? Because she was clearly in contact. That's what the letters show. She sent the galley copies of her book to Damien Eccles and Laurie Davis before it became published for review. Do you think she knows the records and distorting it? Is she in it for the money? Is it sort of an anti-the man stance, even if they did it?
Some of it's anti-authoritarian. Some of it is it's sort of got a countercultural impetus behind it. These are outcasts and so forth. She seems to be hung up on the idea that occult crime is just simply impossible because it's superstitious. And why would anybody do anything so superstitious as an occult crime? Well, the fact is that the people kill for religious purposes all the time. It happens every day, and it's happened for thousands of years, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. And occultism is just one variant of that. And in fact, you take an ideology and a belief system that really is about subverting the order and turning everything upside down and working against norms. And at some point, you're going to edge over into some really transgressive stuff that just might be a crime. And then I don't know how she reconciles that view with what she has to be seeing with Damien Eccles today with his total preoccupation with the occult.
Well, now it doesn't matter. It's just so amazing when you know the really long history. I came into this late. But just the history that I know of experience before he was released, the whole argument by supporters was that he was Buddhist. He had nothing to do with the occult. It was all just satanic panic. And now that he's devoted his whole life to the occult, now it doesn't really matter. That's the new argument.
Right. Like Bob Ruff refers to him as some sort of dabbler in religious belief.
If that's a dabbler, I imagine if someone is really devoted. Oh, my.
I tell you what they really don't understand is, for instance, with like Crowleyan belief, there's absolutely nothing that would be contradictory in like fully devoting yourself to following some sort of Buddhist path for
that's right
10 years or so, because you're just steeping yourself in another tradition that you can draw on and then pull back into your Crowleyan system, because he wrote a lot about Buddhism and apparently was pretty insightful about it. I haven't read his works on Buddhism, and I'm not going to be reading those, but I'll take other people's word for that. And Damien Eccles is fully aware of that. He knows that, and he knows how to cynically exploit people's ignorance, which is a lot of what this is about.
Well, that's an excellent segue into talking about Ken Silverstein, who worked at The Intercept, that at the height of the popularity of Serial, he and Natasha Vargas Cooper, I believe her name is, or Cooper Vargas, did a bunch of different interviews with the prosecutor and also with Jay, the number one, witness against Adnan Syed. And they were just dragged through mainstream media. I just wanted to read this excerpt for after he left The Intercept. He wrote about what happened to him. He writes, "Publishing the Serial stories was a huge headache. There were constant delays and frustration getting them out, even after it became clear they were drawing huge traffic. Our internal critics believed that Natasha and I had taken the side of prosecutors, and hence the state. That support was unacceptable at a publication that claimed it was entirely independent and would be relentlessly adversarial towards the man. That held true even in this case, when the man successfully prosecuted a killer and sent him to jail. Some colleagues like Jeremy Scahill were upset after the first installation of Natasha's interviews with Jay. the state's flawed but convincing key witness, and our co-bylined two-part interview with the lead prosecutor, Ken Urich, both of whom had refused to speak to Sarah Koenig for her serial podcast. Jeremy even threatened to quit over our second installment, according to two of my colleagues who witnessed what they described as his temper tantrum in New York office. He told them he couldn't believe that we'd so uncritically accepted the state's view of the murder, even though our stories were backed up by our own research, our unique reporting, and our reading of the court documents. One day at the office, frustrated Natasha wrote Team Adnan on a sign on Jeremy's office door. And it goes on to say that Jeremy Scahill and Glenn Greenwald delayed their articles by writing their own notes, even though they weren't the editors on the story. I'll link the article in this episode. So that points to sort of a worldview that takes sides with a convicted killer.
Yeah. And a lot of this goes back to an attitude that I've been a part of and I'm familiar with. It goes back, I would say, to at least the Watergate era, where basically a journalist is pitted against the system. A journalist is an iconoclast. A journalist is going to always take the side of the victim and not the state. And so when a journalist doesn't do that, when a journalist actually says, oh, well, the state was right, this witness, despite all his flaws, was actually pointing to the guilty party. If you pay attention to enough of the evidence, you become convinced of that. Then that is not going to be acceptable among the higher ups at the newspaper. They don't get to be higher ups by bumping up against the system. They get to be higher ups by being yes men. In many cases, they're very able. I'm not taking that away. But I've seen many cases where people who just dared to not quite go along with the prevailing attitude in a newsroom, they get shunted off to the side. They may get kicked upstairs if they're good enough and they're already in a position of power. But in many cases, they're just simply put off to the side someplace.
And you brought up a victim, but obviously the victim is Heyman Lee in this case. Yeah. It's so interesting that Adnan Syed so successfully painted himself as a victim. Ditto Damien Eccles, Jason Baldwin, Amanda Knox, which I'd like to talk about. Her father hired Gogarty Marriott before he hired a lawyer and said it was the smartest thing he did. So he hired a public relations firm and successfully, the coverage we got in America was quite different than the coverage in Italy. What do you think that did for her?
Well, over a period of time, it built a case for the fact that she's innocent, whatever the evidence might say. And now she's got, I was looking at her representation, she's with a talent agency, the same talent agency that John Douglas is with, which may explain why they show up at some of the same events. And, she's got a podcast. She's got a very mixed reputation still, I think. But a lot of people would say, oh, yeah, she's innocent, totally innocent. And a lot of that is due to the fact that all those seeds for that were planted by good PR and good marketing in the United States, enough that it had some effect in Italy over a period of time.
Most interesting thing when I talk to people in my personal life about my podcast, when I'm meeting someone, the first thing they want to know is about Amanda Knox. What's the deal with her and why is she so creepy? and they feel, and it's almost like they feel like they're doing something wrong, but right, there's something wrong. She's innocent, right? But she just seems so weird. She just seems so creepy. So I'm not sure she's doing herself so many favors in interviews.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to put your finger on what it is exactly about her, but there's something way off there, way off. And there's some other people who are fit into that category as well. The more you see them, the less convincing they become. Jeffrey MacDonald might be a good example.
Oh, that's a good example. And also there's another side, there's been the Amanda Knox documentary. There's been the Adnan Syed documentary on HBO.
The book she got millions of dollars for, that's really not a very good book, but she got millions of dollars for it. Yeah. And the documentary, right. Another one is Rubin Hurricane Carter. There's another successful case where it became a movie, and now it's a myth of his innocence, right? I would think so. I mean, I don't hear it discussed a whole lot anymore, but that Bob Dylan song kind of sold it at the time, or not really at the time, but somewhat after he was in prison for, he'd been in prison for quite a while at that time, as the song lays out. But the idea was that this wonderfully kind, spiritual, loving man was in prison for absolutely no good reason. And if you actually look at the evidence in the case, it was pretty overwhelming, and they didn't have some of the resources they have now. So there wasn't DNA, but he was driving around. His car was identified. He was identified. He had the bullets matching the weapons used that would go into the weapons used in the shooting in his car. It was 3:00 in the morning. He's driving around with another guy. This shooting was done by two people. And, and it's Paterson, New Jersey. And everybody didn't know him. And he's dressed in a very distinctive way. And he was spotted by somebody who actually knew him. The guy was a sneak thief, but, you just get the witnesses that you get. You don't get to pick and choose your witnesses. So you had that going on for years. He wrote several books. He had this movie with Denzel Washington. I mean, it's an enjoyable movie, and Denzel's never bad in anything, I don't think. So even if the movie's not particularly good, he's always good. So as a movie, it's okay, but it's totally fictitious. It has nothing to do with the real Rubin Carter. He was an awful man. He was violent. He was racist. He's constantly talking about revenge, killing people, bragging about how violent he was in his writings. In fact, one reason he didn't testify in some of the later trials is because he'd written this book that had so many damning passages in it. The fact is between trials, he was also out, and he beat up the woman who was one of his biggest supporters. And this sort of chilled support considerably, including from Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan pretty much stopped singing that song at that point. But you know what? The legend persists anyway.
I was just thinking about some of these, like Adnan Syed. So many of the people who looked into serial really intensely, and it just went nowhere. All roads lead back to Adnan, and it's the Supreme Court has ruled it's sort of dead. Are those cases like fast food, kind of like enjoyable at the time, give kind of like a injustice high? Or injustice porn, it's even been called, and then it's just kind of fade off. And then there's some that, like Rubin Hurricane Carter, when they're attached to maybe a cause, an intense cause like racism, and kind of last as a myth.
I think so. Like the Stephen Avery case, for instance, he's not really a part of, some sort of oppressed group or anything, unless poorly educated Wisconsin rural folk are. Anyway, that family actually had some resources, and it's kind of funny to talk. I was talking earlier about people not having resources and going to trial. He had real money. He had hundreds of thousands of dollars at his disposal that he spent on his very, very good defense lawyers at trial. And of course, he was convicted anyway, but he had resources. So even the idea that he's some sort of poor nothing, at the edges of society, he had resources. He had people pushing for him. He had a supportive family, and, he was still convicted. And then I was amazed at how hard and how aggressive the lawyers were in the trial. Jerry Buting and Dean Strang. And then Kathleen Zellner comes along, and she basically just acts like, oh, they did a really poor job. They should have done this. They should have done this. They should have done this. If I'd been there, I would have done this, this, and this. Well, she probably wouldn't have, because this kind of stuff she's talking about doing, you have to call in even more experts. So you're talking about $1 million case instead of, a couple of $100,000 to defend yourself. And you still are going to come out guilty. That's the bottom line. So it's kind of amazing. I think making a murder will go away. Rubin Carter's probably, they'll probably put up a statue of him someplace in Paterson, New Jersey. They may have one already. They probably need a statue of Rubin Carter in Paterson, New Jersey at this point. And there may be a statue of Adnan, maybe, but it's hard to see him as really as of an oppressed class. But I guess somebody could come up with that. And there are other cases where, The West Memphis Three is just such an intriguing case, and for me personally, it's such an intriguing case, and it just never goes away. It just keeps on going, going, going. I mean, all the court stuff has been over with for years, but they're still out in the public, still doing stuff all the time. It just doesn't go away. Amanda Knox just doesn't go away. She should, but she doesn't.
What do you think the future of Damien Echols and the West Memphis Three cases? Because you were talking about when Damien Echols got out, he was walking the red carpet with, at the time, A-plus list actor Johnny Depp, and his gigs have kind of gone down and down and down and down and down, as far as, I would say he's like at a C level, maybe C- level kind of interviews and gigs with the occasional more prominent interview. What is the future of where this case is? How will it be remembered? How will Damien Echols be treated? Are more people sort of getting to understand what the real case against them was?
I hope so. I think Paradise Lost, to me, set the pattern for a whole subgenre of film about wrongful conviction. And I would argue it still stands up as one of the best in terms of production values, editing, filming, and so forth. It's very well made. It's absolutely misleading. And really, if you look at it the way I look at it, it's pretty ridiculous. It show almost nothing about the actual, other than the grisly footage of the poor little boys' bodies. They tell you very little about what actually went on with the crime or how it could have come about. And it's all a bunch of impressionistic images of a certain version of West Memphis, which isn't really West Memphis. It's a little bit of it, but it's not exactly what West Memphis is, which is a lot more complicated than that. But I think Paradise Lost is going to stand up as a movie where the West Memphis Three are going. I don't know individually. I have no idea what's going to happen with those guys. They've already held up longer than I thought. All three of them have already held up longer than I thought any of them would at this point. But they've had a lot of support and a lot of help. I'm not sure any of them were really capable of committing the crime they committed on their own. I think Echols is too much of a coward. Jason just doesn't really care that much. He got his one big thrill kill out of the way, and now he's on to hamburgers and beer and sucking in whatever he can get from the suckers who send him money to his little proclaimed justice group.
That's someone that people are fooled by. Why do you think Jason Baldwin fools so many people with his sort of nice guy persona?
He looks like a nice, harmless little kid in the movie. He does. I mean, he looks like he's about 12, and he looks like he has like virtually no testosterone in his system. And he's just rosy-cheeked, and, he looks like he's just barely out of diapers. I mean, it's not hard to see why people think he seems to be harmless, but he's not. He's already proven that with his scam on Kickstarter, where I think it's been 6 or 7 years now going on, where he promised he was going to get a book out within a year and then 2, and now it's been, 5, 6 years later. Still no book, but he collected the $30,000 from everybody and hasn't come up with a good rationale yet for why he hasn't been able to come up with his memoirs.
He doesn't need to, because his supporters will come up for a rationale for him. It's amazing, They'll put the words in his mouth. He doesn't have to say anything, and he can block the rest of us on Twitter and Facebook, or the critical crew will just be blocked. So
even poor Jesse Miskelly in West Memphis, he has got ardent supporters there who will just do virtually anything for Jesse. I had some dealings with some of them, always unpleasant. They sent me in something about they were going to have a free the West Memphis rally someplace, and I put it in the newspaper. So, and it was my choice. I could have left it out if I wanted to, because nobody was who's going to call me on it. But they did that several times, and I put it in, and then they had the gall to complain, because very much like Lonnie Sowery, they didn't like the way I was writing about the West Memphis Three, but I was doing it in what I considered to be an objective manner. I don't consider a New York Times story that says they were wrongfully convicted to be stating objective fact. And in fact, New York Times has done that on several occasions. I wrote in to their editors complaining about this and saying, you really need to correct that. It never happened.
Is there anything else we missed? I mean, I know it's such a broad topic.
a whole world of things, but we've covered quite a bit. There's much more there. Each of these individual cases has its own special circumstances that we could be talking about. But overall, I think people are starting to catch on and get the bigger picture that they are being misled grossly by the media, by PR, by marketing on a lot of these cases. There's a lot of skepticism out in the world, and I do think that's growing. How that applies to these individual cases, maybe not so much. They might say, oh, yeah, everything's fake except the West Memphis Three.
Right, exactly. Gary Meece, where can people find you?
I'm still doing a podcast on the West Memphis Three called The Case Against, and you can find that on Apple Podcast and Podbean, among other things. I've got 3 books on Amazon: Blood on Black, Where the Monsters Go, 2-volume set on the West Memphis Three, and a combined, condensed, revised version called The Case Against the West Memphis Three Killers. I'm about to wrap up my podcast on the West Memphis Three. It's like 70 episodes now. So I'm going to do something else, and it's going to be a case. My initial inclination is to do a case that nobody's looked at in about 25 years. It's a very interesting case. I'm not going to say what it is right now. I'll just wait till the time comes. But I thought perhaps just moving on beyond true crime, but it seems like I'm get pulled, it's kind of like Godfather 3.
Pull back in.
Every time I think I'm out, they pull me back in. Anyway, it's been good talking with you again, Roberta.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'll be looking forward to that podcast.
Okay, thank you.